There is a chimney. You have driven past your whole life. 300 metres south of the Westgate Bridge, on a piece of land in Yarraville, 200,000 vehicles a day pass it. You have looked at it from a school bus, from the back seat of a Falcon, from a tradie's ute on a Tuesday morning. You did not know what it was. Here is what it was. For 38 years, 24 hours a day, that chimney fed the looms that wove every pair of Australian jeans. Levi's, Lee, Wrangler, Calvin Klein, Versace. 36 million square metres of denim every year from one factory. The country wore Bradmill on its legs and did not know its name. Then in February 2001, a letter went out to 900 workers. Subscribe before we go further. This story is worse than you think. Chapter 1. The Yorkshiremen. The Bradmill story does not begin in Yarraville. It begins 800 kilometres south of the Arctic Circle, in a soot-blackened English mill town called Bradford, in the West Riding of Yorkshire. By 1950, Bradford was processing 2/3 of all the combed wool on earth. 120 mills inside the city limits. Smoke so thick the street lamps were lit at midday. This was the global capital of textiles, and the boys born there learned to spin before they learned to read. Albert William Keithley was one of those boys. We don't know the exact date of his birth, but we know what kind of childhood he had. Yorkshire textile money was old, hard and Methodist. The Keithley name itself comes from a smaller textile town 9 miles north of Bradford. Generations of his family had worked the wool combs there before the mechanisation of the 1830s. We know he served in the Great War. We know what that means for a man of his generation. 4 years of mud, gas and the survival guilt that came with making it home. We know that on the 8th of January 1918, 6 weeks before the guns stopped, he walked into the parish church at Shipley, Yorkshire, and married a German Jewish merchant's daughter named Erna Laura Salomon. She was 26. He was older. They would have 2 children. They would also have a plan. The plan was to leave. By the late 1920s, the Yorkshire mills were already in decline. Indian cotton was undercutting British wool. American synthetics were arriving, and the textile fortunes of the 19th century were thinning into the 20th. Half the Bradford mills that had been running in 1900 had closed by 1930. So Albert and his brother Frank did what Yorkshiremen had been doing for 200 years. They took the family trade somewhere else. That somewhere else was Sydney. The Keithley brothers established Bradford Cotton Mills at Camperdown in 1925. The company was formally registered on the 22nd of June, 1927. 2 birthdays, one for the factory, one for the paperwork. Both true. The first looms ran in a converted warehouse off Parramatta Road. The first staff were Yorkshire-trained men they had brought with them on the boat, foremen and engineers, who had spent 20 years in the Bradford mills before the family persuaded them to cross the world. In April 1930, Erna arrived in Sydney with the 2 children, and the family settled into a country that had no spinning industry of its own. Erna Laura Keithley became something more than a director's wife. She joined the Sane Democracy League, presided over its women's branch from 1936 to 1938, and became a friend of the legendary suffragist Jessie Street. She organised the Australian Women's Charter Conference in 1943. Her daughter Sylvia would marry the tennis champion Adrian Quist. Her son Geoffrey would play cricket for Yorkshire and Oxford, get elected to the New South Wales Legislative Council, and inherit 3/4 of his father's estate. That estate, when Albert Keithley died in 1948, exceeded £200,000. Yorkshire textile wealth, transplanted to a country that had never seen anything like it. But the real factory, the one that would become Australia's denim empire, wasn't in Sydney. It was 880 kilometres south of Camperdown, on a piece of land in the dirt-poor industrial heart of Melbourne's west. Chapter 2. The Land at Yarraville. Drive west out of the Melbourne CBD over the West Gate Bridge today. Look down. You will see warehouses, container yards, the old Mobile refinery flame, a Greek Orthodox church and a single brick chimney rising out of the residential streets. That chimney sits on a piece of land at 341 Francis Street, Yarraville. It is the most important industrial address in this story. The land had been working since 1925. A company called Davies Coupe & Company had been making shirts and pyjamas there. Cotton drill garments for working men, sold across the Footscray markets and the western suburbs. Davies Coupe was a Melbourne firm. Their factory was an unremarkable brick and sawtooth complex on Francis Street, surrounded by railway lines and small weatherboard houses. In 1939, Bradford Cotton Mills bought a separate site in Footscray, the old Barnett Glass and Rubber Works on Maribyrnong Street. That was their Victorian beachhead. It became one of Footscray's largest employers within 5 years. But Yarraville was the prize. In 1969, Bradford Cotton Mills, by then renamed Bradmill Industries Limited, acquired Davies Coupe outright. The Francis Street site became the anchor address of the entire company. Over the next decade, the buildings would expand south, swallow neighbouring blocks, and become the heart of Australian denim. You have to understand the neighbourhood. Yarraville in the 1970s was Greek. The Greek Orthodox Church sat directly opposite the factory gates. The pub on the corner was called the Cruikshank, and on Friday afternoons after the shift change, 400 men in blue work shirts walked out the gate, crossed the road and ordered a pot of VB. The Sun Theatre, the iconic Art Deco cinema 2 streets over, showed Italian and Greek films through the 70s. The shops along Anderson Street sold lucumades and pasticcerie. Yarraville was not Melbourne. Yarraville was somewhere the rest of Melbourne had not yet noticed. That suburb, that pub, that church, that cinema was about to become the export engine of a country that had never made denim before. Then on the eve of war, the country needed something only Bradmill could provide, and the government came knocking with a contract. Chapter 3. Drill, Duck and the Defence Contract. By August 1939, the Sydney newspaper The Sun was already reporting on Bradford Cotton Mill's rapid expansion. The directors had spent the past year buying capacity. Within 12 months, the government would buy it from them. In 1940, the first Department of Defence contracts arrived at Footscray. The Australian Army needed 3 things: cotton drill for the green uniforms that would be worn from Tobruk to Kokoda, canvas duck for tents, tarpaulins, deck chairs and the fire hoses that would protect Darwin against the bombing, and proofed cotton, which Bradford had been making at Footscray under licence since the late 30s. The Footscray plant tripled its proofing capacity. The Maribyrnong Street factory ran double shifts. Women who had not been a significant part of the textile workforce entered the line in numbers for the first time. They were trained on the looms by Yorkshire-born foremen and ran them around the clock. By 1942, Bradford Cotton Mills were supplying tent canvas for an estimated 40% of the Australian Imperial Forces field accommodation in the Pacific Theatre. The drill cotton went into uniforms worn at El Alamein in Crete on the Kokoda track. Every Australian soldier who survived the war had probably, at some point, slept under Bradford canvas or worn Bradford drill. Then Bradford Cotton Mills made the decision that defined the next 60 years. In a paddock outside Maitland, New South Wales, the Commonwealth had built a munitions factory in 1941, a vast complex on 205 acres at a place called Rutherford. The munitions factory operated from 1941 to 1944. When the war ended, the building stood empty. In 1945, Bradford Cotton Mills partnered with Burlington Mills of the United States to form Burlington Mills Australia and opened a new weaving facility inside the Rutherford Munitions Complex. 200 American pattern looms were installed in buildings that had, 6 months earlier, been pressing brass cartridges for Lee Enfield rifles. The bomb shelters built for the workers are still visible at Rutherford today. The blackout paint is still on some of the window frames. This is the seed. 200 looms in a former munitions shed. By the late 1970s, the company those looms belonged to would be producing 36 million square metres of denim a year, employing 7,000 people across 15 sites, and clothing the world. By 1962, that wartime drill cotton became something else. They started dyeing it indigo. Chapter 4. The Country in Blue Jeans. In 1962, somewhere on the Yarraville factory floor, a vat of synthetic indigo was prepared for the first time. The cotton drill they had been weaving for tents and uniforms went into the dye. It came out blue. They put it on the loom. The loom produced a heavy, woven, cross-twilled fabric. The fabric was called denim. Australia had never made denim before. From that moment until 2000, Bradmill was the only company in the country that did. Here's the kicker. By the late 1970s, at peak, the Yarraville plant alone was producing 36 million square metres of denim every year. Almost enough, in the words of former Managing Director Rob Dixon, to wrap the globe. Read that again. One factory, one Australian suburb, enough denim to circle the planet. 40,000 bales of cotton came in the gate every year from Wee-Waa and Moree. The plant was the third largest water user in the state of Victoria. The monthly electricity bills exceeded $1 million. 1,200 workers walked through the gates every day. Across all 15 Bradmill sites, Yarraville, Footscray, Rutherford, Cottrar, Devonport, Camperdown, Newtown, Ararat, Reservoir and the rest, the company employed approximately 7,000 people. And it was a Maikaro United Nations. The Yarraville plant alone employed workers from 34 different home countries. Italian foremen who arrived in the 1950s. Greek toolmakers and dye house operators who came in the 1960s. Yugoslav weavers, Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian, Macedonian, who arrived in the 1970s. Vietnamese refugees from the late 1970s and 80s. Lebanese families through the 1990s. Chinese technicians by the end. The man who ran the operations side at peak was Bob Green. You will hear his name again in this story. Bob Green, former operations manager at Yarraville, organises a workers' reunion every year now, for the last 15 years. He has been quoted in the oral history documentary commissioned by the developers who currently own the site. His line is the one that opens the door. Quote, "This little place in Yarraville attracted people from Switzerland and Germany because there was nowhere else in the world where these machines were running 24/7. End quote. That's what the chimney was for. The boiler house ran on Madingley brown coal, trucked in from Bacchus Marsh. The boiler fed steam to the dye house jets, where the indigo was bonded to the cotton at high temperature and high pressure. The exhaust went up the stack. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, from 1962 until the early 2008, that chimney was hot. The smoke was visible from the Westgate Bridge from the day the bridge opened in 1978, and the workers, the 34 nationalities, got along. There is testimony from James Joe, a Chinese-born weaving technician, on how the Yugoslav workers behaved through the Balkans Wars of the 1990s. Quote, "You would think that with the war they wouldn't talk to each other or hate each other, but at Bradmill they did not do that. They become better friends." End quote. The denim mill in the Melbourne western suburbs was for 30 years a kind of accidental United Nations that did not exist anywhere else in the country. Where did the denim go? The yardage went out the gate as the fabric for the world's most famous brands. Levi's, Lee, Wrangler, Calvin Klein, Ralph Lauren, Marks & Spencer, Versace, Moschino, Dolce & Gabbana. Max Mara, Diesel's dirty denim line, was Bradmill cotton. The fleecy cotton inside the 1956 Melbourne Olympic Games tracksuits came off the Yarraville looms. The fabric was woven in Australia. It was badged worldwide. In February 1968, the company renamed itself from Bradford Cotton Mills to Bradmill Industries Limited. By then, it owned Davies Coupe, the majority of King G Clothing, Edward Fletcher, Ace Industrial Dry Cleaners, and the Burlington Mills Australia subsidiary. It was Australia's largest textile manufacturer. It exported to 43 countries. It won the Australian Exporter of the Year award in 1998. But the denim that the world wore came at a cost, and by 1973, the cost arrived in one ministerial statement. Chapter 5. The Cost of the Blue. Every great Australian industrial story has a chapter that the company brochures leave out. Bradmill's is no exception. The dye house was hot. An engineer named Denise, who worked her first year at Yarraville in the mid-1970s, recorded her impressions of the place in a personal memoir later digitised online. She remembered the indigo dye house as a very pleasant, almost fresh smelling place because of the denim dyed there with indigo dye stuffs. It was also lovely and warm in winter. The other side of that warmth was the heat in summer, which sometimes hit 50 degrees Celsius next to the dye jets. The other side of the indigo smell was the cotton dust in the spinning sheds. Bisonosis, the chronic lung disease caused by inhalation of cotton fibre, was an industry-wide hazard from Manchester in 1830 to Yarraville in 1980. Bradmill's medical records are not in the public domain, but no one who worked the spinning floor for 30 years walked away without some respiratory cost. The loom's 8 fingers. Anyone who worked a Bradmill spinning frame in the 1970s could tell you about at least one man on their shift who had lost a tip. The Solzer pattern weaving machines ran at 400 picks a minute. A glove caught in the shed, a sleeve in the warp, and the operator went into the machine with the cotton. The first aid room at Yarraville was busier than the supervisor's office. Workers signed forms in English that they sometimes could not read. In 1978, a Greek-born operator named Costas, with no record of his surname, lost 2 fingers on his right hand to a Solzer loom on a Friday afternoon shift. He was back at work on the Monday after the next, bandaged, doing the same job with the hand that had 3 fingers left. There was a mortgage in Footscray. There were 4 children. There was no other shed in Melbourne that would have taken him. Then there was the noise, the drop forge hammers, the looms, the carding machines. Hearing protection was inconsistent through the 1960s, became mandatory through the 1970s, and was sometimes ignored anyway. Ask any Bradmill veteran what the spinning shed sounded like and they will tell you the same thing. You could not hear the man next to you. You learned to lip read in 3 languages. The migrant labour pipeline was a quiet kind of compromise. The newly arrived Greek and Italian workers in the 1960s were given safety briefings in English, signed forms in English, and joined union meetings conducted in English. The Vietnamese workers in the 1980s had it slightly better. By then, the TCF-UA was producing multilingual material. But slightly is the word. And there was an environmental cost that did not become public for 40 years. The Rutherford, New South Wales site, Bradmill's New South Wales fortress and former munitions plant, was identified by the Environmental Protection Authority in 2018 as a centre of PFAS contamination, with oil and liquid waste having been dumped into surrounding waterways and properties for decades. The Maitland Mercury reported the company's atrocious environmental record included oil and liquid waste dumping into surrounding waterways and properties dating back decades. And there is one more thing the company brochures leave out. Yarraville sits on the country of the Gough Whitlam clan, of the Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri peoples. Bradmill operated at 341 Francis Street for 70 years without acknowledgement of that. The current redevelopment includes a statement of country. The factory did not. And on the 18th of July 1973, at 7 in the evening, an Australian Prime Minister addressed the nation. He spoke for less than 15 minutes. By the time he sat down, half the workers at Rutherford no longer had a future. Chapter 6. 25%. The speech was short. Gough Whitlam had been in office for 7 months. His government was facing balance of payments problems, an overheated economy, and inflationary pressure on import competing wages. The Treasurer Frank Klein and Economic Advisor Dr. H.C. Nugget Coombs argued for an unprecedented response. Cut every import tariff in the country, across the board, by 25%. One announcement. One night. No phase-in. At 7 on the evening of the 18th of July, 1973, Whitlam read the announcement to the press in Canberra. The Senate and the union movement found out at the same time as the Liverpool textile worker did. By the next morning, Bradford Cotton Mill's Rutherford plant was on a path that would halve its workforce within 12 months. Across Australian manufacturing, the cuts contributed to the loss of approximately 138,000 jobs in the years that followed. The textile, clothing and footwear sector took the worst of it. Then came the dollar revaluation, then the Jackson Committee of 1974, which recommended further rationalisation. The 1974 oil shock arrived on top. By 1977, Bradmill's Rutherford workforce was a fraction of what it had been in 1972. Bob Green watched it from the Yarraville factory floor. He had been at Bradmill for years already. He saw the Rutherford figures come south. He saw what was coming. Then came the man whose name is on the plan. Senator John Norman Button became Industry Minister in 1983 in the New Hawke government. He was a Melbourne-born lawyer, a Labor moderate, and according to every obituary written about him, a decent and intelligent man who genuinely believed that he was rescuing Australian manufacturing from itself. Read what he said. On the 5th of June 1987, Button delivered the ministerial statement to the House of Representatives that launched the Textiles, Clothing and Footwear Industry Plan. He pitched it as, quote, providing the industry with the conditions it needs to flourish, end quote. Here is what the conditions did. The plan phased clothing tariffs from above 55% in 1989 down to 25% by 2000 and then to 5% by 2005. The effective rate of assistance to the textile, clothing and footwear sector crashed from approximately 70% in the early 1980s to roughly 5% by 2001. In the 1991 Building a Competitive Australia statement, Paul Keating accelerated the cuts. The Productivity Commission later concluded that TCF employment roughly halved between 1986 and 1996. The plan was sold to the unions as compassion. Compassion meant retraining grants, transition packages, regional development funds. It also meant, when the math was done, that for every $1 spent on retraining a Bradmill spinner, $3 came off the tariff wall, protecting her job. The thing to understand is that other countries did not do this. Italian textiles got European Union protection. American denim got Berry Amendment defence procurement. Japanese textiles got industrial policy. Australian textiles got a 5% tariff and a goodbye letter. But while the Australian government was killing the industry slowly with policy, a man in Toorak was killing Bradmill quickly, with cash. Chapter 7. The Polish Rag Trader. His name was Abraham Goldberg. He went by Abe. He had been born in Poland on the 23rd of June, 1929. He was 10 years old when the Germans invaded. He was 16 when the war ended. He survived something that almost nobody in his family survived. He arrived in Australia in the late 1940s with nothing. He started in the rag trade in Melbourne, Flinders Lane, the Schmutter district, the heart of Australian Jewish commerce. He worked, he bought, he built. By the early 1980s, his Linter Group, holding company Entrad Corporation, was acquiring textile assets across the country. He was a buyer, not a builder. He bought distressed companies, stripped what he wanted, sold what he didn't, and folded the rest into the conglomerate. In 1984, Entrad Corporation absorbed Bradmill's yarn and fabric businesses. The Sydney Morning Herald reported it plainly on the 8th of February 1985. The Maitland Mills, it noted, had faced closure by Bradmill and had now been absorbed into Abe Goldberg's Entrad Corporation. The Linter Group emerged in the mid-1980s as one of the largest textile conglomerates in the Southern Hemisphere. By 1989, Abe Goldberg was on the Business Review Weekly Rich List, personal net worth, approximately 600 million Australian dollars. Australia's fourth richest man, he lived in a Toorak mansion on Orrong Road. The chauffeur drove a Mercedes. He was, by his own description, the world's biggest rag trader. He donated to politicians on both sides. He was photographed at gallery openings, at race meetings, at synagogue dinners. The bankers loved him. The press treated him as a self-made immigrant success story, the Polish boy who arrived with nothing and ended up the fourth richest man in the country. But here's the problem. He had borrowed nearly all of it. In 1990, when the recession we had to have arrived, Linter Group collapsed under $1.7 billion of debt. The liquidator was Lindsay Maxted of KPMG. Maxted reported a $1.5 billion gap, the difference between what the book said the assets were worth and what the assets were actually worth. He described the intercompany structure as, quote, an enormously complex web of intercompany relationships, end quote. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. Goldberg fled. Sometime in the second half of 1990, the exact date has never been confirmed, he boarded a plane in Melbourne and flew out of the country. He went to Warsaw, where there was no extradition treaty. He stayed there. He never came back. He was discharged from bankruptcy in 1995 for $5.1 million, a fraction of 1% of the debts. His personal aide, a woman named Katie Boskowitz, was jailed in 1998 for her role in the collapse. She was the only person convicted. The architect of the largest private sector corporate failure in Australian history at that time walked free, in a country where the Australian Federal Police could not touch him. Through all of this, the chimney at Yarraville kept smoking. The looms kept running. The 36 million square metres of denim kept coming off the line. From the outside, Bradmill looked intact. On the inside, the company that owned it had been hollowed out by a $1.5 billion accounting fiction. The workers did not know. Bob Green did not know. The Yorkshire-trained foremen, who were still on the floor, by then in their 70s, did not know. Bradmill survived Goldberg. It limped through the 1990s under a man named Jack Fraser and a reformed entity called the Bradmill Ondar Group. By 1998, the company was named the Australian Exporter of the Year. The Yarraville chimney was still hot. 3 years later, the announcement came. Chapter 8, February 2001. There is no single press release. The announcement, like the closure itself, dribbled out in February 2001 as a series of internal memos, union briefings, and overnight rumours that hardened into letters in the post. By the end of the month, approximately 900 workers at 3 Bradmill sites, Yarraville, Ararat and Reservoir, knew their plants would close. Read that again. 900 workers, most of them over 50, most of them non-English speaking at home, most of them owners of weatherboard houses in Yarraville and Footscray bought in the 1970s on a textile wage, most of them with 2 decades or more of service. most of them about to receive a redundancy package that did not match the entitlements they were owed. Steve Jobanakis was one of them. Greek-Australian, textiles mechanic and supervisor. He had walked through the Francis Street gate every working day for years. He had trained apprentices. He had repaired the Sulzer. It only looms when they broke down on a Sunday night shift. When the letter came, he read it twice. He went home and told his family. His son had been planning to follow him into the trade. His son did not follow him into the trade. Quote, "Our family had been broken apart." The Bradmill Undar Group was placed in receivership in 2001, owing approximately $50 million. The architecture of the company had been carefully constructed for what was about to happen. The group had been split into 9 separate corporate entities. The land, the 3 sites at Yarraville, Ararat and Reservoir, valued by the workers' own representatives at approximately $170 million, sat in one set of entities. The operating company, the one carrying the wages, the long service leave provisions, and the redundancy obligations, sat in another. When the operating company went under, the land entities walked away clean. The Textile, Clothing and Footwear Union of Australia, the TCFUA, mobilised immediately. The Victorian secretary was a young woman named Michelle O'Neill, then in her 30s. She would go on, eventually, to be the president of the ACTU. But in May 2001, she was a union secretary trying to keep 900 workers from being thrown overboard. On the 10th of May 2001, 600 of those workers rallied on the steps of Victoria's Parliament House. The timing was deliberately cruel. That same day, John Howard and the Queen's representative were inside the building reenacting the centenary of Australia's first federal parliament sitting. A military band was playing. Television cameras were running. Outside, 600 Bradmill workers in blue shirts chanted, "Save our jobs," as Howard arrived behind the band. Michelle O'Neill addressed the crowd saying, "Show John Howard what it means to go home and tell your family you don't have a job, and not to know whether or not you're going to get redundancy pay." Carmen Lawrence spoke. Bob Brown made a brief appearance. The Bradmill workers stood in the rain in front of a parliament that was, that morning, performing a ritual celebration of 100 years of Australian Federation, while their industry expired in front of it. There was a parallel happening at the same time. On the same day, Bradmill was announcing the Victorian closures. The National Textiles plant at Rutherford in New South Wales, formerly the Bradford Cotton Mills munitions site from 1945, had only just resolved its own collapse. The chairman of National Textiles had been Stan Howard, brother of the Prime Minister. 350 workers had been locked out at Christmas 1999 over an $11 million shortfall in entitlements. The Howard government, in January 2000, created an emergency employee entitlement support scheme to cover roughly half the gap. That same scheme, extended later as GEARS and eventually as the Fair Entitlements Guarantee, was the only thing protecting the Yarraville workers in 2001. The Prime Minister's brother had taught the country what was about to happen at Bradmill. 6 weeks after the rally, a man named Colin DeLutis walked into the receiver's office with a cheque. He paid $7 million. Chapter 9. $7 million. Colin DeLutis was a Melbourne businessman, a former vice president of the Carlton Football Club. He bought the Yarraville site, plus the remnants of the receivership business, for $7 million Australian dollars in 2002. Over the following years, he bought 2 adjoining blocks for another $16 million. The deal was reported in the property pages, not the industrial pages. The Australian Financial Review noted the site's industrial zoning, its proximity to the Westgate Bridge, and its long-term residential rezoning potential. The trade press did not pretend the deal was about Denim. The trade press knew what it was looking at. He set up new corporate entities to continue limited operations. Bradmill Proprietary Limited and a fashion-facing arm called Denim Connections Bradmill. He received Federal Strategic Investment Program grants. The Victorian government allocated $1.5 million in industry support, then partly revoked it when employment and capital expenditure targets were not met. Bob Green, by then, was no longer the operations manager of an empire. He had a job at the diminished Bradmill Proprietary Limited. He had watched 400 workers shrink to 200, then to 100, then to 40. He arrived at work each morning past a guard post that had once admitted 1,200. He drove home each night through the same Yarraville streets he had driven through since the 1980s, and the streets were emptier of Bradmill blue shirts every Friday. The workforce shrank year by year, from a few hundred in 2002 to under 100 in 2005. In 2007, the last of the Yarraville fabric weaving was transferred offshore. The looms stopped. Michelle O'Neill's verdict on Delutis is on the public record. Quote from The Age, reprinted by the Hand Weavers and Spinners Guild of New South Wales. It suited him to be portrayed as a white knight, but his armour rapidly became tarnished, and there was never any intention to keep a long-term manufacturing presence in Australia. It was always clear that the value in the business for him was more about the site itself than the people and their jobs." End quote. Bob Green's view is gentler, and you will find it in the developer-commissioned oral history. He saw Delutis as a man who tried, who employed people, who kept some manufacturing on Australian soil for 5 more years than would otherwise have happened. Both views can be true at the same time. The script presenter does not need to choose. The arithmetic chose. Here is the arithmetic. From 1962 to roughly 2005, that factory wove approximately 36 million square metres of denim a year. By 2007, it wove 0. The boiler that fed the chimney, the one running on Madingley brown coal from Bacchus Marsh, 24 hours a day for 45 years, was shut down. For the first time since indigo was first dropped into the dye jet, the chimney went cold. The smoke against the western suburbs' sky disappeared. Anyone driving over the West Gate Bridge that month, if they had been watching, would have noticed, but almost nobody was watching. From 2007 to 2021, the factory simply sat, and the urban explorers came. Chapter 10. The Abandoned Years. For 14 years, the Bradmill site at 341 Francis Street was Melbourne's most famous derelict factory. Photographers like Brett Patman of Lost Collective, blogs like Hiking Fiasco, Amy Hall's WordPress dispatches, the F13 Media Documentary Unit, the 28 Days Later Urban Exploration Forum, every one of them came through the broken fence and photographed what was left. The dye house with the indigo stains still on the floor, the boiler house cathedral with light streaming through the roof, the administration block with the Bradmill calendars still on the walls from 2003, the looms in the weaving shed, half stripped for parts, half rusting in place. It became a graffiti gallery, a film location, a backdrop for fashion shoots, an unofficial rite of passage for Melbourne teenagers. Mari Vakakis, a Yarraville writer, later described the site as the place where her Greek grandmother, her yayaya, had worked the dye line, and where her own generation broke in to drink and tag the walls. The metal thieves arrived first, then the photographers, then the fashion shoots. There is a 2014 image by Brett Patman that has been reposted on Reddit hundreds of times. A single white sneaker sitting on the dye house floor, next to a pool of stagnant blue water. The water was indigo. The dye had leached out of the concrete for 7 years. The fence around the site was breached so many times the security company stopped fixing it. Local Yarraville parents told their teenagers not to go in there, knowing they would. One teenager fell through the sawtooth roof in 2016. He survived. In 2015, Colin Delutis sold the cleared land to Tommy Zhang, a Melbourne-based proprietor of Chinese language media, for $160 million. Let that number sit for a moment. The arithmetic: $7 million in 2002, $160 million in 2015. That's a 23-fold return on the land alone over 13 years, with the manufacturing systematically wound down to extract maximum site value. In 2021, Tommy Jang's holding was acquired by a joint venture of Irongate and Frasers Property. Australia, the price was reported at approximately $220 million. The new owners launched the Bradmill Yarraville residential redevelopment. Approved plan, roughly 1,500 dwellings, retail, community facilities. Total project value approaching $2 billion. The display suite opened in March 2024 with a free block party at the Sun Theatre. The first townhomes, the Pioneer Collection, went on sale. The Frasers Property developers commissioned a documentary series called Stories of Bradmill. Bob Green is in it. So is Jackie Carton, the former office administrator who runs the Bradmill Yarraville Facebook reunion page. So is Steve Chobonakis. So is James Joe. So is the line that the Greek and Italian and Yugoslav and Vietnamese workers were a family. The same line, almost word for word, that Michelle O'Neill was using in 2001 to argue against the way the closure was being handled. What survives of the brand? In Denim, in Melbourne's outer western suburbs, a company called Bradmill Outdoor Fabrics Proprietary Limited manufactures specialised technical canvas. It has been owned since 2001 by the British Milleran Company of the United Kingdom. It is the only operating Bradmill on earth. A fashion label called RES Denim uses the heritage trademark for its denim line. The fabric is sourced internationally. This was not the only one. Pacific Brands closed Bond's manufacturing in Australia in 2009 and moved it to China. Brook Textiles in Wangaratta collapsed in 2014. Michelle O'Neill, by then, was leading the same fight in northern Victoria that she had led in Yarraville 13 years earlier. In 2018, she became president of the ACTU. Walk down Francis Street today and you'll find apartments. But walk 3 steps further and the chimney is still there. Chapter 11. What Bradford built. Stand on Francis Street, Yarraville. Today. The boiler house is still there, heritage listed, surrounded by scaffolding and construction hoarding, marked Frasers Properties. The chimney stack still rises against the western suburb sky, 300 metres from the Westgate Bridge, where 200,000 vehicles pass it every day. The dye house and proofing plant are preserved as architectural feature pieces in the new residential development, kept because the City of Maribyrnong Heritage Overlay required them to be kept. Drive across the bridge into the city and you cannot see the factory. You can see the chimney. Lesson 1. Tariff protection was not charity. The Whitlam 25% cut on the 18th of July 1973 cost approximately 138,000 manufacturing jobs in the years that followed. The Button TCF plan from 1986 to 1996 finished what Whitlam started. The effective rate of assistance to textile, clothing and footwear fell from 70% to 5%. By the time both reforms were done, Australia had gone from making roughly 100% of its own denim to making zero. Cheap imports did not flood in because Australian textiles were inefficient. They flooded in because the country's elected representatives, 3 decades in a row, decided that a 5% tariff was civilisation and a 25% tariff was protectionism. Italy kept its textile industry. Japan kept its textile industry. The United States kept enough of its industry to clothe its own army. Australia did not. Lesson 2. The brand is the asset. The country is the cost. Abe Goldberg paid for the Bradmill name. He did not pay for the engineers from Switzerland and Germany who came to Yarraville because it was the only place in the world where the machines ran 24/7. He did not pay for the Greek and Italian and Yugoslav and Vietnamese and Lebanese and Chinese workers who showed up Monday to Sunday for 30 years. He did not pay for the 1956 Olympic Games tracksuits or the World War II tent canvas or the indigo recipe perfected in 1962. Those came free, so when he fled to Warsaw with $1.5 billion gap, the country lost everything except a trademark, which now sits with a British company in Derim. Lesson 3. Foreign capital has no memory. Colin DeLutis paid $7 million for the receivership of Bradmill in 2002. He sold the cleared land 13 years later for $160 million. The workers who built the value of that land, the 900 who got their letter in February 2001, the 1,200 at peak, the 7,000 across all 15 sites, received approximately $24 million in redundancy between them. The arithmetic is the country's epitaph, capital, that buys for the flip cannot inherit the country that wove the world's denim. ASIC watched, the Senate watched, the Victorian government watched. The Prime Minister's brother had run a textile mill into the ground at the same time. Nothing changed. Return to the chimney, the one you have driven past your whole life. It is still there, cold now, surrounded by scaffolding. The boiler that fed it has not been fired in 20 years. Once it made the smoke that wrapped the world in Australian blue. Once it ran 24 hours a day. The country that fed it is somewhere else.